Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There exists in the grim darkness of the far future a being who has witnessed the rise and fall of empires that you and I can scarcely imagine. A consciousness that predates the pyramids, that walked among humanity when we first learned to shape stone and tame fire. This being has seen civilizations bloom like flowers in spring and wither like leaves in autumn, has watched as our species crawled from caves to conquer the stars, only to fall back into darkness and claw our way up once more. His name, if he ever truly had one that we might recognize, has been lost to the ages. But we know him by many titles: the Emperor, the Master of Mankind, the Anathema, the Corpse on the Throne. When we speak of age in the context of Warhammer 40,000, we're not talking about centuries or even millennia in the way you might measure the lifespan of an ordinary dynasty or empire. We're speaking of time so vast that it makes the entire span of recorded human history seem like a footnote. The Emperor of Mankind is, by every measure we can conceive, the oldest human being to have ever existed. Not just in the literal counting of years, though that alone is staggering enough to make your mind reel when you truly consider it, but old in knowledge, old in experience, old in the burden of memory that stretches back to when humanity was young and the galaxy was a very different place. Imagine, if you will, being alive during the construction of the first permanent human settlements. Not cities, not even proper villages, but those first tentative communities where our ancestors decided to stop wandering and put down roots. Now imagine living through everything that came after. Every war, every plague, every moment of triumph, and every descent into barbarism, every technological revolution, and every dark age. Imagine carrying that weight of memory, that impossible accumulation of experience, watching generation after generation live and die while you endure. The Emperor has done exactly that. He was ancient when Rome was founded. He was impossibly old when the first humans ventured beyond Earth's atmosphere. And he has continued, in one form or another, for 10,000 years beyond even that, locked in a prison of his own making, unable to die, and unable to truly live. The story of the Emperor is not a simple tale of heroism or villainy, though it contains elements of both in measures that would crush lesser beings. It's a story about the price of immortality, about the burden of trying to save a species that might not want to be saved in the way you envision. It's about ambition stretched across timescales that turn mountains to dust, about loneliness so profound that it transcends anything a mortal mind could comprehend. It's about becoming something so far removed from what you once were that the very concept of humanity becomes abstract, even as you fight to preserve it. In the current age, the Emperor sits enthroned upon a device called the Golden Throne, deep within the Imperial Palace on Terra. His body, once that of a being of impossible vitality and power, is now little more than a withered husk. The flesh has long since begun its slow decay, kept from complete dissolution only through technologies so advanced that even those tasked with maintaining them no longer fully understand their function. Every day, 1,000 psychers are sacrificed to maintain the psychic beacon he projects, their life forces consumed to keep the Astronomicon burning, that lighthouse in the darkness of the warp that allows humanity to navigate between the stars. Without him, without that beacon, the entire Imperium would crumble. Humanity would be lost, blind, scattered across a million worlds with no way to reach each other, easy prey for the countless horrors that lurk in the darkness between the stars. But this was not always his fate. Once, he walked among us. Once, he was something closer to what we might recognize as human, even if he was never truly one of us in the way we understand the term. To understand the Emperor, to truly grasp the weight of his existence, we must go back beyond the Horus heresy that nearly destroyed everything he built, back beyond the Great Crusade and the Unification Wars, back beyond recorded history to a time when the world was young and humanity had only just begun to understand that it was something special, something with potential for greatness or ruin. The Emperor's story begins in darkness and mystery, and perhaps that's fitting. For all the legends that surround him, for all the worship of trillions and the fear of his enemies, the truth of what he is and where he came from remains shrouded in uncertainty. What we think we know comes from fragments, from accounts that may be propaganda, from sources that have their own reasons for shaping the narrative in particular ways. But from these fragments, we can piece together something resembling a coherent picture. We can trace the outline of the oldest human in existence, and in doing so, perhaps understand something about ourselves and the species we belong to. This is his story, spanning tens of thousands of years. It's a story of power and sacrifice, of vision and tragedy, of hope that refuses to die even when death might be a mercy. It's the story of how one being tried to reshape humanity's destiny and paid a price that continues to compound with each passing moment. It's the story of the Emperor of Mankind, the oldest human in Warhammer 40,000, and it begins in a time so distant that we can barely conceive of it. Origins in darkness, birth of a god. To speak of the Emperor's birth is to venture into territory where myth and history become indistinguishable, where the line between what might have happened and what people need to believe happened blurs beyond recognition. The oldest accounts, those preserved in texts that themselves are ancient beyond measure, speak of a time when humanity first began to develop psykers. These were not the trained and soul-bound servants of the Imperium we know today, but wild talents, shamans who could peer into the warp and draw upon its power without fully understanding what they were touching. These shamans were humanity's first defense against the predations of the warp. When they died, their souls would not simply dissipate into that roiling sea of psychic energy and emotion. Instead, they possessed the ability to reincarnate, to return to the material world with their knowledge and power intact. They guided their tribes and communities, using their gifts to protect and nurture the species through its early, vulnerable stages. They were wise, and they were powerful, and they understood that humanity had a potential that reached far beyond mere survival. But the warp was changing. As humanity spread and grew, as our emotions and desires and fears fed the churning energies of the Imperium, the dangers there grew more focused, more predatory. The entities that would eventually become the Chaos Gods were stirring, not yet the focused intelligences they would later become, but dangerous nonetheless. The shamans began to notice that when they died, their souls were no longer making the journey back to new bodies. Something was consuming them in the warp, devouring their essence before they could reincarnate. They were being lost, and with them, humanity was losing its protectors and guides. Faced with this existential threat, the shamans convened. From across the world, they gathered in a conclave unlike anything that had come before. Thousands of them, representing the accumulated wisdom and power of humanity's nascent psychic potential, came together to discuss what could be done. They knew that individually, they were becoming vulnerable. Separately, they would all eventually fall to the predators of the warp, and humanity would be left defenseless against forces it couldn't even perceive, let alone fight. The solution they arrived at was as desperate as it was unprecedented. They would pool their power, their very souls, into a single being. They would sacrifice themselves, all of them, at the same moment, sending their combined essence into the warp with such force that it would overwhelm anything that tried to consume them. And from that combined psychic force, they would create something new. A new man, they called him. A being who would possess the strength of all of them combined, who would be proof against the dangers of the warp, who would have the power to guide and protect humanity through whatever dark times lay ahead. The ritual they performed must have been staggering in its complexity and in its cost. Thousands of the wisest and most powerful humans who had ever lived, simultaneously ending their own lives, releasing their souls into the warp in a coordinated surge of psychic energy. Can you imagine what that must have been like? The sheer force of it. Their thousands of souls merging, their knowledge and power and essence combining into something that had never existed before. the birth scream of something that was both entirely human and something far beyond humanity as it had been understood. 1 year after this mass sacrifice, in a small settlement along the banks of the Sakarya River in ancient Anatolia, a child was born. The year, by our reckoning, was approximately the 8th millennium before the birth of Christ. The place was a primitive village of the Proto-Hittite peoples, herders and farmers, who had only recently begun to settle into permanent communities. The child's parents were normal humans, his brothers and sisters likewise ordinary. But the child himself was anything but normal, from the moment of his birth, or perhaps even before in the womb. That his psychic power was immense beyond measure. It altered his very genome, rewrote his physiology at a fundamental level. Where the shamans had needed to reincarnate to achieve a form of immortality, this child would simply never age, never sicken, never die, unless through violence so overwhelming that even his incredible regenerative abilities couldn't overcome it. He was a perpetual, the first of a kind that would occasionally appear throughout human history, blessed or cursed with true immortality. As the child grew, his powers began to manifest more fully. He could read minds with ease, could influence the thoughts and emotions of those around him, could perceive things that existed beyond the normal senses. He remembered too. Gradually, as he matured, the memories of those thousands of shamans began to surface. Their knowledge, their wisdom, their understanding of the warp and of humanity's place in the cosmos became his. He was not just one person, but many. A collective consciousness inhabiting a single, immortal form. The stories say that while he was still young, he experienced his first great trauma and his first great act of vengeance. His father was murdered by his uncle, killed for reasons that the fragmentary accounts don't make clear. Perhaps it was simple greed, perhaps some dispute over power or property. But as the young emperor prepared his father's body for burial, touching the cooling flesh in accordance with whatever funeral rites his people practiced, he received a vision. A clairvoyant flash of clarity that showed him exactly how his father had died, showed him his uncle's treachery with perfect, undeniable precision. And the response was immediate and terrible. The child, this being who already possessed power beyond anything his primitive community could comprehend, reached out with his will and stopped his uncle's heart, not with a blade or a blow, but with pure psychic force, causing a massive cardiac event that killed the murderer instantly. It was perhaps the first demonstration of the ruthless justice that would characterize the emperor's approach to ruling in the ages to come. Do wrong, and punishment follows with inevitable, overwhelming force. But this young god, for that's effectively what he was even then, did not immediately reveal himself to humanity as its savior and guide. Instead, he left his village. He traveled to what the accounts call the first city of humanity, likely one of the ancient Sumerian city-states of Mesopotamia. And there he began a long period of observation and subtle influence. He did not announce himself as a ruler or a prophet. He did not demand worship or obedience. Instead, he lived among humanity as one of them, adopting different identities, different roles, watching and learning and occasionally guiding events in small ways. For 38,000 years, he wandered. Let that sink in for a moment. 38,000 years. That's longer than all of recorded human history several times over. That's longer than we've had agriculture, longer than we've had writing, longer than we've had anything we would recognize as civilization. For that entire span of time, this being walked among us, sometimes as a healer, sometimes as a teacher, sometimes as a simple traveler. He saw empires rise and fall. He saw humanity discover fire and invent the wheel, domesticate animals, develop language and art and culture. He saw us make the same mistakes over and over, saw the cycles of peace and war, of enlightenment and barbarism, play out generation after generation. During this time, he wasn't alone in his immortality. Other perpetuals existed, some natural born like himself, others created through means that remain unclear. He associated with these beings, formed relationships with them, sometimes worked alongside them in their own efforts to guide humanity's development. There was Erda, a perpetual woman who would, much later, play a crucial role in the creation of the Primarchs. There was Oleanus Person, a soldier who would fight alongside him in various conflicts throughout history. There were others, each with their own perspectives on what should be done with and for humanity. But the Emperor, even among these immortals, was different. His power was on an entirely different scale. Where other perpetuals might have enhanced strength or healing or some special ability, he possessed psychic might that dwarfed anything else that existed among humanity. He could see not just across distances, but across time, glimpsing possible futures, understanding the vast currents of cause and effect that shaped the galaxy. And what he saw, looking into the future with those impossible eyes, filled him with a determination that would define the next 40,000 years of his existence. He saw the birth of Slaanesh, the youngest of the Chaos Gods, born from the depravity of the Eldari Empire. He saw the age of strife that would follow, when warp storms would cut off human worlds from each other, leaving them to descend into barbarism and madness. He saw the countless Xenos threats that would prey on humanity, the orcs with their brutal strength and love of violence, the Tyranids that would come from beyond the galaxy to devour all life, the ancient Necrons awakening from their tomb worlds. He saw all of this, and he understood that if humanity was to survive, if it was to achieve its potential as a psychic species that could stand alongside or even surpass the ancient Eldari, it would need guidance, it would need protection, it would need a plan that stretched across millennia and encompassed the entire galaxy. So he waited, he prepared, he gathered knowledge and resources, always working toward that distant goal. But he understood that revealing himself too soon would be counterproductive, that humanity needed to develop along certain lines before they would be ready for what he had to offer. And so for thousands upon thousands of years, he remained hidden, a ghost haunting human history, occasionally appearing at crucial moments to nudge events in the direction he deemed necessary, but never revealing his true nature or his ultimate purpose. The being born in that ancient Anatolian village was not yet the Emperor. That title, that role, would come much later. But the foundations were laid in those early years. The power, the vision, the absolute certainty that he knew what was best for humanity, the willingness to make any sacrifice and endure any burden to see his vision realized. All of that was there from the beginning, forged in the combining of thousands of souls and refined through tens of thousands of years of observation and planning. And all the while, he was aging in a way that had nothing to do with years. Each century added to his burden of memory. Each millennium made him more distant from the humanity he claimed to protect. He was becoming something that had never existed before, something that would ultimately be neither entirely human nor entirely divine, but something caught between, unable to fully belong to either category. The oldest human in existence was, even then, slowly ceasing to be human in any meaningful sense. 40,000 years of shadow, the span of time between the Emperor's birth and his emergence onto the stage of history as a public figure is almost incomprehensible. 40,000 years. Give or take a few millennia, depending on which accounts you trust. To put that in perspective, the entire span of human civilization as we understand it, from the first agricultural settlements in the Fertile Crescent to the present day, is less than 12,000 years. The Emperor lived more than 3 times that long in relative secrecy, moving through humanity's story like a shadow, present but not acknowledged, influential but not overt. What did he do during those long ages? The fragmentary accounts we have paint a picture of a being who was simultaneously deeply involved in humanity's development and paradoxically distant from it. He appeared throughout history, always in different guises, never staying in one place or one identity for long enough that his immortality would become obvious. Some scholars of imperial history, those brave or foolish enough to look beyond the official dogma, have speculated about which historical figures might actually have been the emperor in disguise. Was he one of the ancient Sumerian kings, those semi-mythical rulers whose reigns supposedly lasted for implausible lengths of time? Was he among the philosophers of ancient Greece, sharing wisdom that seemed to come from nowhere? Did he walk the streets of Rome, of Constantinople, of any of a dozen other cities that rose and fell while he endured? There are hints, buried in old texts and forgotten histories, of figures who appeared at crucial moments with knowledge they shouldn't have possessed, who performed seemingly impossible feats, who vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Could some or all of these have been the emperor? They're moving through human civilization like a gardener tending to plants, pruning here, fertilizing there, always working towards some distant harvest. The emperor himself, in the rare moments when he has spoken of this time, has suggested that his role was primarily one of observation and subtle guidance. He did not seek to become a king or conqueror, not then. He had seen too many empires rise only to collapse under their own weight, had watched as rulers who seemed enlightened became tyrants, as golden ages turned to dark times. He understood, perhaps better than anyone ever has, the cycles of human history, the patterns that repeated themselves with almost mechanical regularity. Instead, he focused on trying to mitigate the worst excesses of humanity's nature while encouraging the best. When warfare threatened to wipe out entire populations, he would sometimes intervene, working to bring about peace, or at least to limit the slaughter. When plagues swept across continents, he might appear as a healer, using his understanding of biology and his psychic abilities to treat the sick and develop cures. When ignorance and superstition threatened to drag humanity back into darkness, he would promote education and rational thought. But there was a limit to what he could do, a constraint he imposed upon himself, even when it must have been maddening to watch humanity stumble and fall. He could not simply take control, could not declare himself a god-king and order humanity to follow his plan. He had lived long enough to understand that such approaches, however well-intentioned, almost always led to disaster. Or people needed to feel that they were making their own choices, following their own destinies. If he revealed himself too soon, if he tried to force humanity along the path he had chosen, he risked creating exactly the kind of dystopian nightmare he was trying to prevent. So he waited, and he watched, and he endured. And with each passing century, with each generation that lived and died while he remained, he became more isolated from the beings he was trying to protect. How could he not? Imagine forming a friendship, a genuine connection with another person, only to watch them age and die while you stayed eternally young. Now imagine doing that thousands upon thousands of times. Eventually, the pain of that loss, repeated over and over, would have to numb you to it. Eventually, individual humans would cease to be people in the way you had once understood that term, and would become more like cells in a larger organism. Important in aggregate, but not individually mourned. This increasing distance from baseline humanity was perhaps inevitable, but it shaped the emperor in ways that would have profound consequences later. He began to see humans less as individuals with their own hopes and dreams, and more as resources to be managed, pieces to be moved on a cosmic game board. His perspective became increasingly focused on the species as a whole, rather than on the people who comprised it. Individual suffering, individual desires, individual lives became less important than the grand trajectory of humanity's development. During this time, yet he also came to understand the true nature of the warp and the threats that lurked within it. He had always been psychic, had always been able to perceive the Imperium, but his knowledge grew more refined and more terrifying with each passing age. He watched as the Chaos Gods took shape, as human emotion and desire fed their growth, as they became more focused and more dangerous. He understood, in a way that perhaps no other being in the galaxy could, the existential threat they posed to humanity and to all sentient life. This knowledge drove him to develop what would eventually become the imperial truth, the philosophy that would underpin his later empire. he came to believe that humanity needed to be weaned off of superstition and religious belief, that faith in gods and demons and other supernatural entities only fed the chaos gods and made them stronger. Humanity needed to embrace rationality, science, atheistic enlightenment. Only by denying the chaos gods, the worship and belief that sustained them, could humanity hope to survive. It's worth noting the profound irony here, one that the Emperor himself must have been aware of, even as he formulated this plan. He was a being of immense psychic power, effectively immortal, possessing abilities that to any reasonable observer would seem godlike. And yet he was planning to create a civilization that denied the existence of gods, that ridiculed and suppressed religious belief. He was setting himself up as the ultimate secular authority, the embodiment of reason and enlightenment, even as he was, perhaps the least human thing in existence. Throughout these long ages, he also associated with other perpetuals, those rare beings who shared his immortality, if not his power. These relationships were complicated, marked by a mixture of camaraderie and fundamental disagreements about what should be done with and for humanity. Some of the other perpetuals, like Erda, believed that humanity should be allowed to develop naturally, without interference from beings like themselves. Others, like Oleanus, were more willing to work alongside the Emperor, but ultimately came to question his methods and his growing detachment from the very people he claimed to want to save. These disagreements would eventually lead to rifts, to perpetuals leaving the Emperor's circle or even actively opposing him. Erda, in particular, would later betray him in a way that nearly destroyed his greatest work, scattering his Primarch sons across the galaxy in an act that was either motivated by maternal instinct or by a belief that his plans for them were too terrible to allow. Oleanus, too, would eventually find himself at odds with the Emperor, stabbing him during a dispute over how to handle a warp-corrupted tower, an act that speaks to just how fraught these relationships had become. But perhaps the most important relationship the Emperor developed during this time was with a man named Malcador, who would later become Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor and one of the few beings he seemed to genuinely trust. Unlike the other perpetuals, Malcador was not born immortal. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary human who somehow gained extended life, or perhaps through the Emperor's intervention. What made Malcador special was not his power, though he was a formidable psyker in his own right, but his judgment, his wisdom, his ability to see beyond immediate concerns to the longer game the Emperor was playing. Malcador understood, perhaps better than anyone else, what the Emperor was trying to do and why. He also understood the costs, both to the Emperor and to everyone else involved in his grand plan. Where the Emperor had become increasingly distant and abstract in his thinking, Malcador retained a connection to baseline humanity, could still see people as individuals rather than just as components of a species. This made him invaluable as a counselor, someone who could remind the Emperor of the human cost of his decisions, even if that reminder didn't always change those decisions. As the millennia passed and the Emperor's plan took shape, he began to make more concrete preparations for the day when he would finally emerge from the shadows. He traveled to certain worlds, to places of power where the barrier between the material universe and the warp was thin. On Molech, he and several other perpetuals traveled to a warp gate, where the Emperor is said to have made some kind of bargain or theft of power from the Chaos Gods themselves. What exactly happened there remains unclear, but it seems to have been a crucial step in his eventual creation of the Primarchs, giving him knowledge or abilities that he would need for that monumental undertaking. He also began to identify and cultivate certain bloodlines, certain genetic traits that would be useful when the time came to create his armies of transhuman warriors. The gene troopers and enhanced soldiers that would later form the backbone of his unification forces didn't appear out of nowhere. They were the result of thousands of years of careful breeding programs, of selecting for certain characteristics and eliminating others, all without the participants ever knowing they were part of a plan that stretched back further than their entire civilization. And always, he was learning. Every technological advancement humanity made, every scientific discovery, every innovation in warfare or governance or social organization. The emperor studied it, understood it, incorporated it into his growing knowledge base. By the time he was ready to emerge, he possessed an understanding of science and technology that surpassed anything that existed in his current era, and possibly anything that had ever existed. He was, in effect, a walking library of all human knowledge across 40 millennia, combined with psychic power that made him the most formidable individual in the galaxy. But all of this knowledge, all of this power, all of these thousands of years of preparation came with a cost that the emperor either didn't see or chose to ignore. He had become something that was no longer truly human in any meaningful sense. His perspective was so vast, so encompassing, that individual human lives and concerns had become almost invisible to him, except as they related to his larger plans. His emotions, if he still had them in the way we understand the term, had been worn down by time and isolation until what remained was a kind of cold determination, an absolute certainty in his own judgment that left no room for doubt or alternative viewpoints. The being who would eventually emerge to lead humanity into a new age was, in many ways, more alien than the Xenos he would fight against. He had lived among humans for 40,000 years, but he had never truly been one of them. He was the oldest human in existence, but that long life had paradoxically stripped away much of what it meant to be human. And yet, he genuinely believed that he was humanity's only hope, that without his guidance and protection, the species would inevitably fall to chaos or be destroyed by Xenos or tear itself apart in endless warfare. Whether he was right about that, whether his terrible certainty was justified, what remains one of the great unanswerable questions of Warhammer 40,000. What we know for certain is that when the Emperor finally decided the time was right to emerge from the shadows, when he finally took up the mantle of leadership openly and declared his intention to reshape humanity's destiny, he did so with the accumulated weight of 40,000 years driving him forward. He had waited so long, prepared so thoroughly, that turning back or admitting doubt was no longer possible. The die was cast, and humanity's fate, for better or worse, was now tied to the vision of its oldest living member.
You know, I've been researching Warhammer for quite a while, and the Emperor's story always gets to me. Here's this being who genuinely believed he was saving humanity, who planned for literally tens of thousands of years, and somehow it went wrong anyway. What strikes me most is how relatable that is, despite the cosmic scale. Haven't we all had moments where we were absolutely certain we knew the right path, only to watch everything fall apart? The difference is when we fail, maybe a project tanks or a relationship ends. When the Emperor failed, it condemned trillions to 10,000 years of suffering. That's the tragedy that keeps me coming back to the story. The gap between his intentions and the reality he created. It makes you wonder if being the oldest, most powerful human actually made him less capable of understanding what humanity truly needed. Sometimes I think the Emperor's real curse wasn't being trapped on the golden throne. It was being so far beyond human that he could never truly save us, no matter how hard he tried. But anyways, let's get back to the story.
The Unification and the Thunder Warriors. The Age of Strife was, by any measure, one of the darkest periods in human history. The warp storms that had isolated human worlds from each other for thousands of years were finally beginning to abate. But the damage had been done. Old Earth, the birthplace of humanity, and once the center of a vast, galaxy-spanning civilization, had descended into barbarism. The planet was divided among countless warlords and tyrants, each ruling over their own piece of territory through a combination of advanced technology, salvaged from better times, and brutal force. These techno-barbarian kingdoms fought endless wars against each other, each convinced of their own righteousness, each caring nothing for the suffering their conflicts caused. Terror itself was almost unrecognizable from the world that had spawned humanity. Centuries of warfare and environmental damage had turned much of the surface into an irradiated wasteland. The once great cities of the old world were now ruins, picked over by scavengers and squatters. The oceans had dried up, leaving behind vast expanses of toxic dust and the skeletal remains of ancient ships. The air itself was barely breathable in many places, choked with pollution and the residue of countless chemical and radiological weapons. Humanity, on its home world, was dying, locked in a cycle of violence and decay that seemed to have no end. It was into this nightmare that the Emperor finally stepped into the light. The exact timing is unclear, but it was sometime in the late 29th millennium. He had decided, after watching and waiting for so long, that the moment had come to act directly. Perhaps it was the lessening of the warp storms, the opportunity to finally unite humanity across the stars, while perhaps it was the dire state of terror itself, the recognition that if he waited much longer there might be nothing left to save. Or perhaps it was simply that his patience, vast as it was, had finally reached its limit. He did not reveal himself all at once, did not appear in a blaze of glory and demand that everyone acknowledge his authority. Instead, he began as he had so many times before, as a leader among others, though this time he did not hide the extent of his abilities or his ambitions. He gathered to himself those who saw the same truth he did, that Terra's fractured state was unsustainable, that the only path forward was unification under a single, powerful authority. Among these early followers was Malcador, his old friend and advisor, who took the title of Sigillite and became the Emperor's right hand in the campaign to come. But followers and advisors were not enough. If the Emperor was to conquer Terra, to bring all its warring factions under his control, he would need an army unlike any that had been seen before. The techno-barbarian warlords had their own enhanced warriors, soldiers who had been genetically modified or cybernetically augmented to be stronger and tougher than baseline humans. To defeat them, the Emperor would need something better, something that represented a leap forward in the science of creating superhuman soldiers. This was when he created the Thunder Warriors. The Thunder Warriors were the first of the Emperor's transhuman soldiers, the prototype for the Space Marines that would come later. They were built from the genetic material of exceptional human warriors, enhanced through a process that the Emperor himself had developed using his vast knowledge of genetics and biology. The changes made to them were brutal in their efficiency, stripping away everything that didn't contribute to making them into perfect instruments of war. They were taller than normal humans, massively muscled, capable of feats of strength and endurance that seemed impossible. They could shrug off wounds that would kill ordinary soldiers, could fight for hours without rest, could inspire terror in their enemies just by their appearance. But the Thunder Warriors were also deeply flawed, though whether those flaws were accidental or intentional remains a matter of debate. Their enhancements were unstable, causing both physical and psychological deterioration over time. They were aggressive to the point of being barely controllable, prone to fits of rage and violence that sometimes turned against their own comrades or innocent civilians. Their lifespans were short, their bodies burning themselves out in a matter of years or even months, rather than the decades a normal human might live. They were, in many ways, exactly what was needed for the brutal wars of the unification. But they were not sustainable as a long-term solution. The Emperor organized the Thunder Warriors into 20 legions, each led by a warrior who held the title of Primarch, though these were not the Primarchs that would come later. These early Primarchs were simply the best and most effective of the Thunder Warriors, promoted to positions of leadership based on their martial prowess and tactical acumen. They were mortal, enhanced, but ultimately human, and they led their legions in the Emperor's name as he began the long, bloody process of bringing terror to heel. The wars of unification were not glorious. They were grinding, brutal affairs, fought across the ruined landscapes of terror with a ferocity that added to the devastation that already existed. The Emperor's forces, led by the Thunder Warriors, crushed opposition wherever they found it. Entire armies were annihilated. Fortresses that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Populations that resisted were put to the sword or scattered. It was a campaign of total war, of absolute commitment to victory, regardless of the cost, and it was effective. One by one, in the techno-barbarian kingdoms fell. The Emperor's empire expanded from its initial holdings, swallowing up more and more of Terra's surface. Some rulers surrendered when they saw the futility of resistance, pledging allegiance to the Emperor in exchange for being allowed to live and perhaps to hold some measure of authority under the new order. Others fought to the bitter end, preferring death to subjugation. The Emperor cared little which choice they made. What mattered was the result, the steady progress toward total control of humanity's home world. Among those who chose to join rather than fight was a powerful techno-priest from a kingdom near the Urals, a woman named Olivia Sureka, who was herself a perpetual and who had known the Emperor in earlier times. And she brought with her knowledge and resources that proved valuable to the growing empire. There were others too, skilled warriors and administrators and scientists who saw in the Emperor's vision something worth serving, even if they didn't fully understand the scope of his ambitions. It was during this time that Malcador suggested to the Emperor that he adopt a formal title, something that would encapsulate his role as the supreme authority of the new order, being forged in fire and blood. The Emperor agreed, and thus he became the Emperor, a title that was both a statement of political authority and a callback to the old Earth rulers who had held that position in ancient times. It was a name that suggested not just power, but legitimacy, not just conquest, but right to rule. Thus, the culmination of the unification wars came with the pacification of the last major resistance, the defeat of the final warlords who had held out against the Emperor's advance. The battles were fierce, the casualties enormous, even by the standards of what had come before. But the outcome was never in doubt. The Emperor had committed himself fully to this path, and he would not be denied. When the last enemy fortress fell, when the last warlord bent the knee or died refusing to do so, Terra was unified for the first time in millennia under a single ruler. But victory brought a new problem, one that the Emperor had almost certainly anticipated, but that he handled with a ruthlessness that shocked even those who had fought beside him. The Thunder Warriors, for all their effectiveness, were no longer needed. More than that, they were a liability. Their unstable genetics made them unsuitable for the next phase of the Emperor's plans. Their brutal nature and short lifespans meant they couldn't be used as peacekeepers or administrators. And their very existence as warriors who had no purpose beyond war made them dangerous in a time when the Emperor needed to transition from conquest to consolidation. So the Emperor ordered their extermination. The event came to be known among those few who survived and remembered it as the culling. The Thunder Warriors were gathered together under the pretense of a great ceremony to honor their victory, to celebrate the unification they had fought so hard to achieve. And there, with the last of Terra's enemies defeated, they were betrayed and slaughtered by the very forces they had fought alongside. It was efficient, as it was brutal, and it was absolutely in keeping with the Emperor's approach to problems that couldn't be solved through negotiation or manipulation. Some Thunder Warriors escaped the culling, scattering into the wastelands of Terra or hiding among the general population. Their ultimate fate varies, but they were few enough that they posed no real threat to the Emperor's new order. The majority died that day, killed by soldiers who understood that they were witnessing something monstrous, but who followed their orders nonetheless, because the Emperor commanded it, and the Emperor was not to be questioned. This act, this cold-blooded elimination of warriors who had served faithfully and well, tells us something important about the Emperor's character at this point in his existence. He had become entirely focused on the end goal, and on the vision of humanity's future that drove him. Individual lives, even the lives of those who had been instrumental in achieving his victories, were expendable if they no longer served that vision. Loyalty, sacrifice, years of service, none of that mattered when measured against the greater plan. It was a utilitarian calculus taken to its absolute extreme, and it would not be the last time the Emperor would make such decisions. With Terra unified and the Thunder Warriors disposed of, the Emperor stood at the head of a world that was battered and exhausted, but finally at peace. The constant wars were over. The techno-barbarian kingdoms were gone, replaced by a single government under his absolute authority. The population, those who had survived the unification wars, looked to him with a mixture of awe, hope, and fear. They didn't know what he would do next, didn't understand the scope of his ambitions. They couldn't have imagined that the conquest of Terra was just the beginning, that their emperor was already looking to the stars, planning a campaign that would dwarf the unification wars in scale and ambition. The oldest human in existence had finally emerged from the shadows and claimed his throne. Terra was his, and soon, if his plans came to fruition, the entire galaxy would follow. But to achieve that, he would need more than thunder warriors or any army of ordinary humans could provide. He would need something new, something better, something that could endure across the vast distances and impossible dangers of the galaxy. He would need his sons, his Primarchs, and the legions of Space Marines that would follow them. Guess the great work, Primarchs and Space Marines. After the unification of Terra, the Emperor withdrew into the labyrinthine depths beneath the Himalayan mountains. There, in gene laboratories that had been constructed in utmost secrecy during the final years of the unification wars, he began work on what would become his greatest achievement and his most terrible failure. The Primarch project represented the absolute pinnacle of genetic engineering, an attempt to create beings that would be to normal humans what humans were to simpler life forms. He was going to make demigods, and he was going to use his own genetic code as the foundation. The process of creating the Primarchs was staggeringly complex, involving sciences that even the most learned members of the Mechanicum couldn't fully understand. The Emperor took his own genome, that impossibly sophisticated genetic code forged from the combined essence of thousands of ancient shamans and refined through 40,000 years of life, and from it, he created templates, not clones, but unique beings, each one crafted to embody certain aspects of his own capabilities while also possessing their own distinct characteristics. Where the Emperor contained all of humanity's potential within himself, each Primarch would represent a specific facet of that potential, focused and refined to superhuman levels. But genetics alone, however advanced, could not create what the Emperor envisioned. He delved into arts that were forbidden even to him, tapping into the power of the warp itself to imbue his creations with capabilities that transcended purely biological enhancement. Some accounts suggest he made a bargain with the Chaos Gods themselves during his journey to Molech, stealing or trading for knowledge and power that he would use in the Primarch project. Other sources hint at different, equally dark sources of the supernatural energies he wove into his gene-sons. The Emperor didn't work alone on this project. Erda, the perpetual woman who had known him since ancient times, contributed her own genetic material to the Primarchs, making them in some sense her children as well as his. This would later prove to be a crucial factor in their scattering, as Erda's maternal connection to them would override her loyalty to the Emperor when she saw what he planned to make them into. The creation of the Primarchs took years, perhaps decades. The Emperor labored in his underground laboratories with a focus that excluded almost everything else. Even Malkador saw him rarely during this time, and when they did meet, the Sigillite could see the toll the work was taking. The Emperor was pushing himself to the very limits of what even he could achieve, weaving together biology and warpcraft, science and sorcery in ways that had never been attempted before. Finally, after immense effort and countless failed experiments, success. 20 gestating Primarchs, each one floating in their own amniotic tank, each one developing according to the Emperor's design. They were perfect, or as close to perfect as the Emperor could make them. Each one was designed to mature into a being of impossible capability, a general and leader who could command armies across entire star systems, and a warrior who could stand alone against threats that would annihilate normal forces, an administrator who could govern worlds and sectors with wisdom and efficiency. Each Primarch was also designed to be the progenitor of their own Space Marine Legion. From their genetic code, the Emperor would be able to create the gene seed that would transform ordinary humans into Astartes, transhuman warriors who would possess some fraction of their Primarch's capabilities. It was an elegant system, a way to mass-produce superior soldiers while maintaining a clear chain of genetic descent from the Emperor himself through the Primarchs to the Space Marines they would command. But the Chaos Gods were watching, and they were afraid. They understood, perhaps better than anyone save the Emperor himself, what he was trying to achieve. Again, he was planning to create a psychic species that would no longer need to travel through the warp, that would be immune to their blandishments and temptations, that would deny them the worship and emotion that sustained them. The Primarchs were a crucial part of that plan, and so the Chaos Gods struck, reaching through the warp into the Emperor's most secure facility and tearing open a rift that scattered the infant Primarchs across the galaxy. Or perhaps it wasn't the Chaos Gods at all. Some accounts claim that it was Erda who created the warp vortex that scattered the Primarchs, that she acted to save her children from a fate she found unbearable, even if it meant betraying the Emperor and potentially dooming humanity. Whether she was manipulated by chaos into taking this action, or whether she acted of her own accord, remains unclear. What matters is the result. The infant Primarchs were lost, cast through the warp to land on 20 different worlds scattered across the galaxy. Some landed on relatively civilized planets, others on death worlds where simply surviving to adulthood required superhuman capability. Some were welcomed and raised by caring families. Others grew up in brutal circumstances that shaped them in dark ways. Each Primarch's upbringing would influence their character and the character of the Legion they would eventually lead, creating a diversity that the Emperor may or may not have intended, but which would prove crucial to the success of the Great Crusade that was to come. The Emperor's reaction to the loss of his Primarchs speaks volumes about his nature. He did not rage or despair, did not waste time or resources trying to track them down immediately. Instead, he adapted. He had collected genetic material from each of the Primarchs before their scattering, and from these samples, he could still create the gene seed necessary to make Space Marines. They would lack Primarchs to lead them, at least initially, but they could still serve his purpose. Thus began the creation of the Space Marine Legions. The process of making a Space Marine was, and remains, one of the most complex and dangerous medical procedures imaginable. Young human males, usually recruited in their early adolescence, would undergo a series of surgical implantations over the course of several years. 19 different gene-engineered organs would be installed in their bodies, each one derived from the Primarch's genetic template, each one serving a specific function in transforming them from human into something beyond human. The transformation was brutal, and not all survived it. Many aspirants died during the process, their bodies rejecting the implants or unable to cope with the massive physiological changes being forced upon them. But those who survived emerged as Astartes, standing head and shoulders above normal humans, possessed of strength and resilience that made them the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. They could fight for hours without fatigue, could survive wounds that would kill ordinary soldiers instantly, could process information and react to threats with speed that seemed superhuman, because it was. But Space Marines were more than just enhanced soldiers. But the gene seed that transformed them also carried something of their Primarch's personality and mindset, traits that would express themselves as the Marine matured and developed. Even without ever meeting their gene sire, Space Marines of a particular legion would share certain characteristics, certain ways of thinking and approaching problems that reflected their Primarch's nature. This would later prove to be both a strength and a terrible weakness, when fully half the legions followed their Primarchs into damnation during the Horus Heresy. The Emperor didn't stop with the creation of the Space Marines. He formed alliances, most notably with the Mechanicum of Mars, the Techno-Priests who controlled the Red Planet, and its forges. This alliance was crucial, providing the Emperor with the industrial capacity to equip his growing armies and fleets. The Mechanicum believed the Emperor to be the Omnissiah, the avatar of their machine god, a belief he encouraged even as he privately scoffed at all religion. It was a pragmatic arrangement, one that gave both parties what they needed, even if it was built on a mutual misunderstanding of each other's true nature. With Terra unified, the Space Marine legions being built up, and the alliance with Mars secured, the Emperor was nearly ready to launch the Great Crusade that would carry humanity's banners back out into the galaxy. But he wasn't content to simply recreate the old human empire that had existed before the Age of Strife. He wanted something better, something that would endure. And that meant he needed to solve the problem of warp travel and the vulnerability it created to chaos. This led to the Webway project, perhaps the most ambitious of all the Emperor's plans. The Aeldari possessed a network of tunnels through the warp, artificial passages that allowed them to travel between points in real space without actually entering the warp itself. If the Emperor could access this webway, or better yet, create humanity's own version of it, then human ships would no longer need to risk the predations of chaos every time they wanted to move between systems. Humanity could travel safely across the galaxy, and more importantly, they could begin to evolve into a psychic species without the constant danger that their powers would attract demonic attention. The Emperor began work on this project even as he prepared for the Great Crusade, laboring to create a portal that would link Terra to the Webway. It would require an immense psychic effort to maintain, more than even he could sustain indefinitely. But he planned to eventually hand this duty over to one of his Primarchs, specifically Magnus the Red, who had been designed with psychic capability that exceeded all his brothers. Magnus would sit upon the Golden Throne, the device that regulated the portal, and use his power to maintain humanity's connection to the Webway, while the Emperor moved on to other tasks. It was a good plan, a brilliant plan even, one that showed the Emperor's vision extending thousands of years into the future. Like so many of his plans, it would be undone by factors he didn't account for, but by the human elements that his vast intelligence and long experience somehow failed to fully comprehend. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the Webway project could fail, before Magnus could doom it in his desperate attempt to warn his father about Horus, the Great Crusade had to be launched. The Emperor had to find his scattered sons and reunite them with their legions. And for a brief, shining moment, it would seem like everything was working exactly as he had planned. The creation of the Primarchs and the Space Marines represented the Emperor's greatest work of genetic engineering, the culmination of knowledge gathered over 40,000 years, combined with power and ambition that knew no limits. They were his legacy, his gift to humanity, the instruments through which he would reshape the galaxy in humanity's image. Yet they were also the seeds of his downfall. For in creating beings so powerful and so independent, he had created the means by which his entire vision could be subverted and destroyed. But the Emperor, for all his foresight, couldn't see this yet. Or perhaps he could, and simply believed that the potential benefits outweighed the risks. Either way, the die was cast. The Great Crusade was about to begin, and the oldest human in existence was about to become the most powerful human in history, standing at the head of armies that could conquer star systems and wielding authority that spanned light years. It should have been his moment of ultimate triumph. Instead, it was the beginning of his greatest tragedy. The Great Crusade, humanity's golden age. The Great Crusade began in approximately 798 of the 30th millennium. Launching from Terra with a fanfare that probably couldn't be heard in the void of space, but was nonetheless glorious in its intention. The Emperor stood at the head of fleets that numbered in the thousands of ships, commanded armies numbering in the millions of space marines, and behind them, billions of normal human soldiers of the Imperial army. It was a force unlike anything the galaxy had seen in living memory, and it was all dedicated to a single purpose: to reunite the scattered fragments of humanity and bring them under the aegis of the newborn Imperium of man. The early crusade was slow going, hampered by the fact that the Primarchs were still scattered, and the gene seed necessary to create new Space Marines in large numbers was limited by the Emperor's insistence that all new gene seed be derived from his own genetic material to prevent corruption and mutation. But the Emperor had patience, born of 40,000 years of waiting. He understood that building an empire that would last millennia couldn't be rushed. Better to move methodically, to ensure that each world brought into compliance was truly integrated into the Imperium, rather than conquered in name only and left to fester in resentment. The pattern of the crusade was established early. Expeditionary fleets would push out from Terra, identifying human-settled worlds and making contact. Some worlds welcomed the Imperium, seeing in it protection from the countless threats that plagued the galaxy and a chance to rejoin the larger human civilization. These worlds were brought into compliance peacefully, their leaders given positions in the new order, their resources integrated into the Imperium's growing industrial and agricultural base. Other worlds resisted, for reasons that varied from the understandable to the insane. Some had developed their own strong cultures and weren't interested in submitting to the dictates of a distant emperor they had never heard of. Some were ruled by tyrants who knew they would lose their power under imperial rule. Some had been corrupted by chaos or dominated by Xenos and couldn't be reasoned with at all. For these worlds, the Imperium brought war. The Space Marines were perfectly designed for this kind of warfare. They could deploy rapidly, strike with overwhelming force, and eliminate resistance with a combination of superior equipment, superhuman capability, and tactical brilliance. Watching a Space Marine Legion at work was like watching a scalpel wielded by a master surgeon. They didn't just win battles, they ended wars before they could truly begin, striking at enemy command structures and logistics with precision that left the opposing forces leaderless and unable to coordinate resistance. But the Great Crusade was about more than just military conquest. The Emperor had a vision for humanity that went beyond simply controlling territory. He wanted to transform human civilization itself, to create a culture based on reason and science rather than superstition and religion. To this end, he deployed iterators alongside his military forces, orators and philosophers whose job was to spread what the Emperor called the imperial truth. The imperial truth was simple in its core concepts, but radical in its implications. There were no gods, it proclaimed. The universe operated according to natural laws that could be understood through reason and empirical observation. Religion and superstition were not just wrong, but actively harmful, feeding the power of entities in the warp that sought humanity's destruction. Humanity's salvation lay in embracing atheistic enlightenment, in turning away from faith toward knowledge. The irony of this, of course, was that the Emperor himself was arguably the closest thing to a god that existed in the material universe. His power was immense, his lifespan effectively infinite, or his knowledge and capabilities beyond anything a normal human could aspire to. And yet he insisted that there were no gods, that he himself was just a man, albeit an exceptional one. He forbade worship of himself, going so far as to publicly humiliate his son Lorgar and the Word-Bearers Legion when they began to spread a cult of the Emperor's divinity. This rejection of his own deification would, in time, prove to be a critical error. Humans have a fundamental need to believe in something greater than themselves, and by denying them the comfort of faith while failing to replace it with something equally meaningful, the Emperor created a spiritual void that chaos would eventually fill in the hearts of those who turned traitor. But during the early crusade, this didn't seem like a problem. The imperial truth was spreading, but worlds were coming into compliance, and the Emperor's visions seemed to be manifesting exactly as he had planned. The real transformation of the Great Crusade began when the Emperor started to reunite with his lost Primarchs. The first to be found was Horus, discovered on the gang-controlled world of Chthoniya. The moment of their meeting must have been extraordinary. Father and son recognizing each other despite never having met. drawn together by bonds of genetics and something deeper, something that transcended mere biology. Horus was everything the Emperor had hoped for, a natural leader with a combination of martial prowess and charisma that made him the perfect general. Horus took command of the 16th Legion, which he would rename the Lunar Wolves and later the Sons of Horus, and immediately proved himself in battle after battle. Yet he was the Emperor's favorite, his most trusted son, the one who seemed to understand best what his father was trying to achieve. Horus fought at the Emperor's side through the early decades of the Crusade, leading victories that brought hundreds of worlds into compliance. The Emperor showed him a level of trust and affection that he seemed incapable of showing to anyone else, even Malkador. One by one, the other Primarchs were found and reunited with their legions. Lemon Russ on the ice world of Fenris, where he had been raised by wolves and become king of his own savage tribe. Rogal Dorn on Inwit, a harsh world where he had learned the importance of duty and fortification. Robut Gilliman on Macragge, where he had been raised as a noble and created an efficient, prosperous realm through careful governance. Sanguinius on Baal, gifted with wings and suffering from a psychic curse that showed him his own death. Magnus the Red on Prospero, where he had delved deeply into psychic knowledge in ways that worried even his father. Each Primarch was unique, shaped by their upbringing on wildly different worlds, but all shared the superhuman capabilities the Emperor had engineered into them. They were brilliant strategists, fearsome warriors, charismatic leaders who inspired absolute loyalty in those who served under them. With the Primarchs leading them, the Space Marine legions became even more effective, each one developing its own distinct character and approach to warfare that reflected their Primarch's personality. The Great Crusade entered its golden age. Thousands of worlds were brought into compliance every year. Humanity's domain expanded at a rate that seemed almost unstoppable. The Xenos that had preyed on isolated human worlds were driven back or exterminated. The Emperor's vision of a unified human Imperium stretching across the galaxy seemed to be becoming reality. During this time, the Emperor worked on his other great project, the Webway Portal, beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra. He increasingly left the conduct of the Crusade to Horus and his other sons, trusting them to continue the work of expansion while he focused on what he saw as the more important long-term goal of securing humanity's future through access to the Webway. This withdrawal from the front lines of the Crusade would prove to be a terrible mistake, creating a distance between the Emperor and his sons that would fester into resentment and misunderstanding. The Crusade reached its apex at the Battle of Olenor, where the Emperor and his sons faced the largest greenskin empire that had been encountered during the entire campaign. The green-skinned Xenos had built an empire spanning star systems, their savage war cries echoing across dozens of worlds as they prepared to launch an attack on humanity's expanding territories. The Emperor led the assault personally, fighting alongside his Primarchs in what became one of the most legendary battles of the Great Crusade. The victory at Olenor was total. The greenskin warlord was slain by the Emperor himself, the Orcish Empire was shattered, and humanity's dominance of that region of space was secured. But it was also at Olenor that the Emperor made a decision that would set in motion the events leading to the Horus heresy. Yet he announced his intention to return to Terra permanently, leaving the conduct of the Crusade in the hands of Horus, who he named War Master, with authority over all the other Primarchs. For Horus, this appointment seemed like the ultimate honor, recognition of his status as first among equals, proof of his father's trust and confidence in him. But it also placed an impossible burden on his shoulders. He was now responsible for managing not just his own legion, but coordinating the actions of all his brothers, each of whom was a prideful demigod in their own right, each of whom had their own ideas about how the crusade should be conducted. And he had to do all of this while the Emperor withdrew to Terra to work on a project that he wouldn't explain to his sons, leaving them to wonder if they had somehow failed or disappointed him. as the Emperor's retreat to Terra to focus on the Webway project showed the fundamental flaw in his character that would ultimately doom his entire vision. For all his vast intelligence and accumulated wisdom, he couldn't understand the emotional needs of the beings he had created. He saw the Primarchs as tools, admittedly sophisticated and valuable tools, but tools nonetheless. Their feelings of abandonment, their need for recognition and approval, their very human desires for connection with their father, all of this either didn't register with him or registered as irrelevant compared to the work he needed to do. He didn't explain the Webway project to them, didn't share his larger vision in a way that would have helped them understand why he was leaving. Instead, he simply announced his intention to return to Terra and appointed Horus as his proxy, expecting that this would be enough. It wasn't. The seeds of doubt and resentment that would eventually flower into betrayal were planted in that moment. Though no one, not even the Emperor with all his foresight, seemed to recognize it. The Great Crusade continued for a time after the Emperor's withdrawal, but the Golden Age was ending. The Primarchs who had issues with their father's approach, who had suffered traumas during their upbringings that the Emperor either couldn't or wouldn't address, began to feel increasingly distant from the Imperium they were supposed to be serving. Lorgar and the Word-Bearers, humiliated for their worship of the Emperor, began to search for other gods to venerate. Angron and the World-Eaters left their Primarch forever damaged by the butcher's nails that had been hammered into his brain on his home world, grew ever more savage and uncontrollable. Magnus and the Thousand Sons delved deeper into psychic powers that they didn't fully understand, despite warnings from the Emperor about the dangers. All of this should have been recognized as warning signs, but the Emperor was focused on his work beneath the palace, struggling to establish and maintain the connection to the Webway. He trusted Horus and the other loyal Primarchs to handle any problems that arose, not understanding that some of those problems were with the Primarchs themselves, that the issues ran deeper than military setbacks or logistical challenges. And then, in a development that the Emperor should have foreseen but somehow didn't, Horus fell. The circumstances of his corruption have been documented elsewhere. The combination of pride and ambition and a genuine grievance against a father who seemed to no longer care, all exploited by chaos, until Horus became something he would have been horrified to become during the early golden days of the Crusade. He became the war master of chaos, the champion of the dark gods, and he began to turn his brothers against their father. The Great Crusade, humanity's brief moment of hope and unity, was ending. The Horus heresy, the worst civil war humanity had ever endured, was beginning. And the Emperor, the oldest human in existence, who had planned for 40,000 years to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe, had somehow let it happen anyway. All his knowledge, all his power, all his preparation had not been enough to prevent the one thing that could doom his entire vision: betrayal from within, by the very sons he had created to be his greatest achievement. Betrayal and the heresy. The news of Horus's betrayal reached the Emperor through Magnus the Red, though the manner of that warning would itself become a catastrophe that undid much of what the Emperor had been working toward. Magnus, who had witnessed Horus's fall through his psychic abilities, tried to warn his father using the fastest method he knew: a direct psychic communication across the vast distances of space. But to achieve this, Magnus delved into sorcerous powers he didn't fully control, and broke through the psychic wards protecting the Emperor's laboratory and the Webway portal he had been laboring to create. The result was catastrophic. Magnus's warning tore open the incomplete portal to the Webway, creating a breach that allowed demons to pour through directly into the heart of Terra itself. The Emperor's grand work, the project that was supposed to secure humanity's future, was ruined in an instant. Worse, the breach couldn't be sealed, not fully. The Emperor was forced to sit upon the Golden Throne himself, using his psychic might to hold back the demonic tide that threatened to overwhelm Terra and corrupt the entire planet. This was perhaps the most bitter moment in the Emperor's impossibly long life. His son had destroyed his greatest work in an attempt to warn him about another son's betrayal. The irony must have been like a blade to the heart, if he still had a heart in any meaningful sense. He was trapped now, bound to the Golden Throne, and unable to leave even for a moment lest the demons break through and unleash hell itself upon humanity's home world. The Emperor sent his custodians and the Sisters of Silence into the webway to fight a desperate holding action against the demonic hordes. The war within the webway became a grinding nightmare. Imperial forces fighting and dying in the impossible geometries of the alien-built tunnels, holding the line against enemies that couldn't truly die, that would simply reform in the warp and attack again. It was a battle that couldn't be won, only endured, buying time for the Emperor to figure out some way to permanently seal the breach. Meanwhile, Horus was making his move in the wider galaxy. He had been careful in his corruption, of converting his brother Primarchs and their legions to his cause in ways that hid his true intent until it was too late for the Emperor to easily counter. The massacre at Istvan III, where loyalist elements within the traitor legions were annihilated by their own brothers, announced the heresy's beginning in blood and fire. Istvan V, where 3 loyalist legions walked into a trap and were nearly destroyed by the combined forces of the traitors, showed that Horus was willing to use any deception and any level of brutality to achieve victory. The Emperor watched all of this unfold from his seat upon the Golden Throne, able to perceive events through his psychic senses, but unable to act directly, bound to the endless task of holding back demons. He could issue orders through Malkador and his other agents. Could try to coordinate the loyalist resistance, but he couldn't lead from the front as he once had. The frustration must have been agonizing for a being who had been so active, so directly involved in shaping events for 40,000 years. As the heresy progressed, as more and more of the Imperium was consumed by the civil war, the Emperor was forced to make increasingly desperate decisions. He ordered the remaining loyalist forces to fall back toward Terra, abandoning much of the territory that had been claimed during the Great Crusade. He couldn't afford to fight Horus across the entire galaxy, not while bound to the throne. Better to gather his strength, to fortify Terra itself and the solar system around it, and force Horus to come to him. After 5 years of maintaining the stability of the webway portal, the Emperor's physical form began to show signs of strain. This being, who had endured for 40,000 years without showing any sign of aging, was finally exhibiting fatigue. His nose would bleed, even in psychic visions he sent to his custodians. The constant psychic effort of holding back the demonic tide was taking a toll that even his perpetual nature couldn't completely mitigate. When the demon Drachnien was born in the warp, an entity of pure malevolence and incredible power, the Emperor knew he had to act. He ordered the Sisters of Silence to gather 1,000 psychers from across the galaxy and sacrifice them to the Golden Throne, using their psychic energy to power the device for a single day without his presence. Then he left the throne and plunged into the webway himself, leading the desperate evacuation of his forces from that demon-infested nightmare. The battle within the webway must have been a sight beyond description. The Emperor, unleashed from his throne, wielding the full extent of his power against the hordes of chaos. Demons that had never known defeat were swept aside like insects. The very fabric of the webway burned with the Emperor's psychic fire as he carved a path for his retreating forces. When he confronted Drachnien, the first demon, the end of empires itself, he couldn't destroy it, but he did seal it within the body of his custodian Ra Endymion, ordering the loyal warrior to run as far into the webway as he could and never stop running, carrying the demon away from Terra and humanity. After this desperate action, the Emperor returned to the Golden Throne and sealed the webway portal as best he could. He couldn't repair what Magnus had broken, couldn't complete the project that had consumed so much of his effort. All he could do was contain the breach, maintain the seal, and accept that his grand vision for humanity's future was dead. If the Imperium survived the heresy at all, it would have to survive without the webway, vulnerable to the warp, and all the horrors it contained. This realization, this understanding, that even if he won the war against Horus, he had already lost his dream for humanity's future, seemed to break something in the emperor. When he spoke to his custodian Diocletian Koros afterward, he admitted for the first time that he didn't know how to save humanity from eventual extinction. Whether it took a year or 10,000 years, the forces of chaos would eventually win unless humanity could free itself from dependence on warp travel, and without the webway, that seemed impossible. Even as he grappled with this devastating realization, Horus was advancing on Terra with his armada of traitor legions and corrupted Imperial army forces. The siege of Terra would be the final confrontation, the moment when everything the Emperor had built over 40,000 years would stand or fall based on the outcome. Rogel Dawn and the Loyalist forces prepared as best they could, fortifying the Imperial palace into a fortress that would make even the most determined attacker pay dearly for every meter of ground they took. The siege itself was a nightmare of unprecedented scale. Billions died as Horus's forces crashed against the palace's defenses like a tide of corrupted flesh and steel. The traitors had the advantage in numbers, and they had the blessings of the Chaos Gods, which granted them powers and abilities that defied the natural laws of the universe. But the Loyalists had the advantage of terrain, and they were fighting for their very survival, for the survival of humanity itself. Neither side could afford to lose, and so they fought with a desperation and brutality that turned the cradle of humanity into a charnel house. The Emperor watched from the depths of the palace, still bound to the golden throne, still holding back the demonic tide from the webway. He couldn't join the battle directly, not while the portal remained unsealed. All he could do was trust in his sons, as in Dawn and Sanguinius and the other Loyalists, to hold the line until Horus made a mistake, or reinforcements arrived from the Loyalist legions still making their way toward Terra. But Horus, corrupted and empowered by chaos as he was, remained a brilliant tactician. He knew that time was not on his side, that Robute Guilliman and the Ultramarines were approaching, that Leman Russ and the Space Wolves were fighting their way through the traitor forces, blocking their path to Terra. If he didn't break the palace's defenses soon, he would be caught between the defenders and the reinforcements, and even the power of chaos wouldn't save him from that crushing vice. So Horus made a desperate gambit. He lowered the shields of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, effectively inviting the Emperor to teleport aboard and face him in single combat. It was either supreme confidence or complete madness, but it achieved its goal. The Emperor, seeing the opportunity and perhaps seeing in his precognitive visions that this was the only path to victory, left the Golden Throne. Malcador the Sigillite, his oldest and most trusted friend, took his place upon the device, using his own psychic might to maintain the seal on the webway portal while the Emperor confronted his fallen son. Malcador knew he was going to die. The power required to maintain the seal was beyond anything a perpetual could endure, even one as strong as he was. But he did it anyway, because that's what was needed. Because the alternative was allowing demons to overwhelm Terra while the Emperor was absent. And it was the final act of loyalty from someone who had served faithfully for longer than most civilizations had existed, and it cost him everything. The confrontation between the Emperor and Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit has been the subject of countless legends and artistic depictions. The accounts vary in details, but the core facts seem consistent. Horus, empowered by all four Chaos Gods, fought with a fury and power that matched and perhaps exceeded the Emperor's own. The battle destroyed vast sections of the ship, reality itself bending and breaking around them as they clashed. The Emperor held back, even in the face of Horus's assault. He loved his son, despite everything, and he couldn't bring himself to deliver a killing blow. He tried to reach through the corruption, to find some fragment of the Horus he had known, the son he had trusted and favored above all others. This hesitation nearly cost him everything. Horus, fully given over to chaos, had no such compunctions. He struck the Emperor down, landing blows that would have killed any other being instantly. Then Sanguinius arrived, the angel, the most noble and heroic of all the Primarchs. He had fought his way through the ship to reach his father and brother, driven by duty and love and his own psychic visions, showing him what was to come. He confronted Horus, tried one last time to appeal to whatever remained of his brother's honor and sanity. When that failed, he attacked, wings spread, fury and grace combined in desperate combat. Horus killed him, broke his body, and ended his life with a brutality that showed just how far the once noble war master had fallen. And it was this act, at the murder of Sanguinius, that finally broke through to the emperor. Not the burning of worlds, not the corruption of his other sons, not even the destruction of his webway project. It was watching Horus kill Sanguinius, seeing the casual cruelty with which he ended one of the brightest lights humanity had ever produced, that showed the emperor beyond any doubt that his son was truly lost. The emperor unleashed his full power. No more holding back, no more hoping for redemption or salvation. He struck at Horus with psychic might that had been accumulated over 40,000 years, with the combined strength of thousands of ancient shamans, with power that transcended anything the Chaos gods had granted their champion. Horus's body was destroyed so completely that not even his soul remained. Obliterated so utterly that even Chaos couldn't bring him back or resurrect him. But the cost of that victory was terrible. The emperor's body was broken, his very essence torn and scattered by the wounds Horus had inflicted. Rogel Dawn found him in the throne room of the vengeful spirit, barely alive, unable to speak except through psychic communication. The emperor gave his final orders: return him to Terra, place him upon the golden throne, and never let him die. The Imperium would need the Astronomicon, would need his psychic presence to guide ships through the warp, would need whatever protection his nearly dead form could still offer against the predations of Chaos. They brought him back to Terra, back to the Golden Throne, where Malkador had died maintaining the seal. They interred the Emperor upon that device, converting it from a simple portal regulator into a life support system of unfathomable complexity. His shattered body was connected to the throne's mechanisms, his fading life sustained by technology that the Mechanicum barely understood and couldn't hope to replicate. He has remained there ever since, neither dead nor truly alive, the oldest human in existence, reduced to little more than a psychic beacon and a failing corpse. Entombed in gold, 10,000 years of torment. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has sat upon the golden throne, imprisoned within a device that is simultaneously keeping him alive and slowly killing him. His physical form, once that of a being of impossible vitality and power, has deteriorated to the point where some describe him as little more than a withered husk, and a corpse held together by technology and will. The injuries inflicted by Horus have never healed, cannot heal, because the Emperor's perpetual nature has been overridden by the constant psychic effort required to maintain his multiple functions. The Golden Throne itself is a marvel of archaeotech, a relic from the dark age of technology that has been modified and adapted for purposes its original creators never imagined. It uses a combination of psi-fusion reactors, stasis fields, and other technologies that are now beyond the understanding of even the most learned tech priests to keep the Emperor's body from completely decaying. Countless cables and tubes connect the Emperor to the device, some feeding nutrients into what remains of his digestive system, others monitoring vital signs that barely register as being from a living being. But the technology alone isn't enough to keep the Emperor functional. Every single day, 1,000 psychers are sacrificed to the Golden Throne. These psychers, gathered from across the Imperium by the Black Ships, are brought to Terra and led before the throne in groups. There, through a process that nobody fully understands and everyone finds horrifying, their life force is drained away to feed the Emperor's psychic might, to sustain the Astronomicon, to keep the seal on the webway breach intact. Imagine being one of those psychers, knowing that you're going to die, that your death won't be quick or heroic, but will instead be a slow draining of everything that makes you who you are. Your very soul consumed to keep a being alive who has been dying for 10,000 years. 1,000 of them, every single day, for 10 millennia. The mathematics are staggering. 365 million psykers, give or take, have been sacrificed to keep the Emperor alive since the Horus heresy ended. That's more people than lived on Earth in the Emperor's own time, all of them dying to sustain a single being. The Astronomicon is perhaps the most crucial service the Emperor provides from his throne. This psychic beacon, powered by the Emperor's will and sustained by the sacrifice of psykers, projects a light into the warp that can be perceived from anywhere in the Imperium. It serves as a navigation aid for ships traveling through the warp, a lighthouse in the darkness that allows navigators to plot their courses and avoid being lost forever in the Immaterium's shifting tides. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium would effectively cease to exist. Individual systems might survive, but communication and trade between them would be nearly impossible. Humanity would fracture back into isolated pockets, exactly the condition that allowed the horrors of the Age of Strife. But the Astronomicon comes with a terrible irony. The same psychic signal that allows the Imperium to function also serves as a beacon to the Tyranids, drawing the alien hive fleets toward Terra like moths to a flame. The Emperor, trying to save humanity, has inadvertently painted a target on humanity's homeworld, attracting one of the most dangerous threats the species has ever faced. Whether he understands this consequence, whether he cares, whether he has any choice in the matter at all, remains unknown. The seal on the Webway portal is the Emperor's other great task, and possibly the more important of the two, as though the Imperium's citizens don't know about it. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the portal that Magnus's warning tore open still exists, and beyond it, demons still press against the barrier the Emperor maintains. If that seal were to fail, if the Emperor's concentration on that task were to lapse for even a moment, demons would pour into the heart of Terra itself. The planet would fall to chaos within days, perhaps hours, and with it would go any hope of the Imperium's survival. This means the Emperor cannot rest, cannot allow his focus to waver, cannot experience anything like true unconsciousness. For 10,000 years, he has remained in a state of perpetual vigilance, his mind stretched across multiple simultaneous tasks, each one critical, each one demanding his constant attention. What does that do to a mind, as even one as vast and powerful as the Emperor's? How does a consciousness that was once capable of tenderness and love and hope endure 10 millennia of nothing but duty and pain, and an endless, grinding effort to simply maintain the status quo? The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, maintain a constant watch over the throne room. These golden-armored warriors, each one a work of genetic art that makes even a space marine seem crude by comparison, stand vigil over their dying master with a devotion that borders on religious fervor. They guard not just against physical threats, but against anyone who might disturb the Emperor's concentration or interfere with the complex machinery of the throne. They are witnesses to his suffering, though whether the Emperor is even aware of their presence is unclear. The Sisters of Silence, yet the psycho-hunting order of warrior women who served the Emperor during the Great Crusade, also maintain a presence near the throne. Their nature as blanks, as humans, with no presence in the warp, means they can perceive the Emperor differently than those with psychic sensitivity. Where psychers and normal humans see the Emperor as a radiant figure of golden light, the sisters see him as he truly is, a shriveled, pain-racked figure, his mouth open in a silent scream, his face aged beyond recognition by the agony of his eternal vigil. These two perspectives on the Emperor, the golden god versus the suffering mortal, perfectly capture the fundamental ambiguity of his current state. Is he still the supreme intellect that guided humanity for 40,000 years, still capable of plans and strategies that stretch across millennia? Or has the pain and the isolation and the sheer grinding monotony of his existence reduced him to little more than a psychic engine, a mind trapped in an endless loop of maintenance tasks, with no room left for anything that might be called thought or will? The Emperor does seem to maintain some level of awareness beyond simply powering the Astronomicon and holding back demons. Reports exist of saints and other holy individuals receiving visions that they attribute to the Emperor's guidance. The Emperor's Tarot, a divination tool used by psychers and other imperial officials, seems to offer genuine insights into the future in ways that suggest someone or something is providing those insights. Living saints, humans imbued with miraculous powers that allow them to perform impossible feats. He claimed to be acting on the Emperor's behalf and seemed to possess knowledge they couldn't have obtained through normal means. But whether these interventions represent the Emperor as he was, capable of complex thought and purposeful action, or whether they're simply the psychic equivalent of reflex actions from a being whose conscious mind has long since fragmented into something unrecognizable, remains unclear. The Emperor hasn't had a confirmed, coherent conversation with anyone since he was interred upon the throne, with one exception. Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch, who returned from stasis in the 41st Millennium. Guilliman's account of meeting with his father is chilling in its implications. He describes the Emperor as cold, distant, seeing him not as a son but as a tool, an asset to be deployed in the ongoing war against humanity's enemies. The being Guilliman met didn't seem to care about him as an individual, didn't offer comfort or wisdom or even acknowledgement of their familial relationship. It simply gave orders, assigned tasks, and dismissed him when the audience was over. Guilliman came away from that meeting deeply disturbed, questioning whether his father had ever truly loved him or any of his brothers, or whether they had always been nothing more than weapons to be used and discarded as needed. This coldness might represent who the Emperor has always been beneath the masks he wore during his long life, the fundamental nature that 40,000 years of pretending to be human couldn't fully suppress. Or it might be what he has become, the result of 10,000 years of unimaginable suffering stripping away whatever capacity for warmth and connection he once possessed. Either way, it's a far cry from the being who once walked among humanity, who supposedly guided and protected our species through its early development, who created sons that he claimed to love, even as he prepared to use them in his grand design. The condition of the Golden Throne itself has become increasingly dire as the centuries pass. The technology that keeps it functioning is decaying, failing in ways that the Mechanicum cannot repair because they don't understand how it works. Tech priests perform maintenance rituals that are more prayer than engineering, desperately trying to keep the ancient machinery operational through a combination of hope, blind faith, and occasional lucky guesses about which components might be replaceable. Several times over the 10 millennia since the heresy, the throne has come perilously close to complete failure. Each time, desperate measures have been required to keep it functioning, usually involving the sacrifice of even more psychers than usual to compensate for failing systems. The latest crisis, occurring in the closing years of the 41st millennium, revealed failures in the throne's mechanisms that are far beyond the Mechanicum's ability to repair. Some tech priests privately estimate that the throne has perhaps a few centuries left before it fails completely, and when it fails, the Emperor will die. What happens when the Emperor dies has been the subject of theological and practical debate within the Imperium for millennia, as some believe he will reincarnate, that his perpetual nature will allow him to be reborn and rise again to lead humanity. Others claim that he will ascend, becoming a true god in the warp, a deity who can protect humanity from chaos on a spiritual level rather than through the crude mechanism of psychic power and sacrifice. Still others fear that his death will simply be the end, that the Astronomicon will go dark, the webway portal will burst open, and humanity will be destroyed within a generation. The Inquisition maintains a level of information suppression around the Emperor's true condition that borders on paranoia. The general population of the Imperium is encouraged to believe that the Emperor is actively guiding events, that he watches over them personally, that he cares about each individual human soul. The reality that he's been dying slowly for 10,000 years, that he's kept alive only through technology nobody understands, and sacrifices that would horrify most citizens if they knew the details, is deemed too dangerous to be widely known. But whispers spread anyway, as they always do. In the underhives and frontier worlds, in the private communications of educated elites, and the secret councils of planetary governors, people discuss the Emperor's real state with a mixture of horror and desperation. What do you do when the foundation of your entire civilization is literally dying? When the being who has served as humanity's shield against annihilation for 10 millennia might have only decades or centuries left? Do you prepare for the end, or do you pray for a miracle? Some groups, particularly those associated with the more radical elements of the Mechanicum and certain inquisitors, have begun working on solutions. Robert Guilliman and Archmagos Belisarius Call are reportedly searching for ways to either repair the Golden Throne or possibly even allow the Emperor to die and be reborn. These efforts are dangerous, both in the practical sense of potentially causing the throne's immediate failure and in the political sense of challenging the religious orthodoxy that has built up around the Emperor's eternal vigil. The Emperor's current state represents perhaps the most terrible irony in all of Warhammer 40,000. He planned for 40,000 years to guide humanity to a future where they would be free from the tyranny of gods and superstition. He created an empire based on reason and science, dedicated to the imperial truth that denied the existence of the divine. And now, 10,000 years after his vision failed, he has become exactly what he tried to prevent: a god worshipped by trillions, sustained by faith and sacrifice, the center of a religion that has replaced the very thing he fought against. The oldest human in existence has become effectively the first human god, and he has paid for that transformation with an agony that has lasted for 10 millennia and shows no sign of ending. Whether he's even aware enough to appreciate the irony, whether any part of the being who planned and schemed for 40,000 years remains conscious enough to understand what he has become, is a question that may never be answered. All we know for certain is that he endures because he must. That's because without his presence on the Golden Throne, everything he fought for, everything he sacrificed for, would come to nothing. His powers and nature. To understand what the Emperor truly is, we must examine not just what he has done, but what he is capable of doing, the nature of his power, and the fundamental essence of his being. The Emperor is not simply a very powerful psyker or a very old human. He is something that has no real parallel in the galaxy, a confluence of factors and circumstances that created a unique entity that straddles multiple categories without truly belonging to any of them. At the most basic level, the Emperor is a perpetual, a member of a rare mutant branch of humanity gifted with true immortality. Perpetuals possess extraordinarily rapid and efficient cellular regeneration, as allowing them to heal from almost any injury given time. They don't age beyond physical maturity, remaining in their prime indefinitely. They can survive dismemberment, suffocation, even decapitation, and complete disintegration, their bodies regenerating and returning to life after clinical death. This makes them effectively immortal, barring specific circumstances or extremely powerful forces. But the Emperor is not just any perpetual. He is, by all accounts, the most powerful perpetual who has ever existed, possibly because of the circumstances of his creation through the mass suicide of thousands of shamans. Where other perpetuals might take days or even weeks to regenerate from serious injuries, the Emperor could heal almost instantly during his active years. But where others might have enhanced physical abilities or minor psychic talents, the Emperor possessed capabilities that defied categorization. His psychic power is the most obvious and most terrifying aspect of his nature. He is, without question, the most powerful human psyker ever to exist. His mind can perceive events across vast distances of space, can communicate telepathically with individuals on the other side of the galaxy, can reshape reality itself through sheer force of will. During the war within the Webway, when he briefly left the Golden Throne to rescue his forces, he swept aside demonic hordes that would have destroyed entire armies, his psychic fire burning through the warp-spawned entities like they were made of paper. The Emperor can see the future, though not with perfect clarity. He possesses a form of precognition that allows him to perceive possible outcomes of events, to understand the likely consequences of different choices and actions. This ability was crucial to his long-term planning, allowing him to scheme across timescales of millennia with confidence that his plans had a reasonable chance of succeeding. However, this foresight is not absolute. The Chaos Gods can cloud his visions, and individual human choices, particularly those of beings as powerful as the Primarchs, can create divergences he doesn't foresee. His physical capabilities, while not as emphasized as his psychic powers, are equally superhuman. Before his interment on the Golden Throne, the Emperor was described as a giant among men, though his exact appearance seems to have varied depending on who was looking at him. This is because the Emperor possesses the ability to manipulate perceptions, to appear to each person in a form that their mind finds appropriate or awe-inspiring. To some, he might appear as a golden giant in ornate armor. To others, as a wise elder whose face seems familiar but can't quite be remembered. To the Sisters of Silence, who are immune to psychic influence, he appeared as an unassuming man of average height and build, unremarkable except for the intensity of his gaze. This perceptual manipulation extends beyond simple appearance. The Emperor can project an aura that inspires awe, loyalty, and even love in those around him. This isn't mind control in the crude sense, but rather a psychic influence that makes people want to follow him, want to believe in his vision, want to serve his cause. It's part of how he was able to gather followers to his banner during the Unification Wars and maintain the loyalty of billions during the Great Crusade. People simply couldn't help but be drawn to him, couldn't help but believe that he was special, that he was right, that he was worth dying for. His intelligence is another aspect of his power that deserves examination. The Emperor possesses not just high intelligence, but accumulated knowledge from 40,000 years of life. He has learned and mastered every field of human endeavor, from biology and genetics to physics and engineering to philosophy and warfare. This isn't just theoretical knowledge either. He has practical experience applying these disciplines across different technological levels and cultural contexts, making him potentially the most skilled craftsman, scientist, and warrior who has ever lived. This knowledge manifests in incredible creative ability. The Emperor designed the Primarchs, creating 20 unique genomes that would give rise to demigod warriors, each one a masterpiece of genetic engineering. He created the gene seed system that allows for the transformation of normal humans into space marines. He built the Astronomicon, a psychic beacon of such power that it can be perceived from anywhere in the Imperium. He designed weapons and armor for himself and his custodians that represent the absolute pinnacle of what can be achieved when infinite skill and resources are combined. But perhaps the Emperor's most significant power, the one that defined his approach to ruling and to his long-term planning, is his absolute certainty in his own judgment. This isn't listed in any codex or rulebook, but it's apparent in everything he did. The Emperor never seems to have doubted himself, never seems to have considered that his vision for humanity might be wrong, or that his methods might be flawed. He proceeded with plans that would reshape the galaxy with the confidence of someone who knew, beyond any possibility of error, that he was right. This certainty was both a strength and a terrible weakness. It allowed him to pursue goals that would have seemed impossible to anyone else, to make sacrifices that a more doubtful leader wouldn't have been able to justify. But it also blinded him to warning signs, made him unable to accept input that contradicted his vision, and prevented him from adapting when circumstances changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The Horus Heresy, in many ways, can be traced back to this fatal certainty. This inability to see that his sons were more than just tools, that they had emotional needs he wasn't meeting, that his withdrawal to focus on the Webway project was being interpreted as abandonment rather than trust. The Emperor's nature as both human and more than human creates a fundamental paradox at the heart of his existence. He claims to fight for humanity, to want to preserve and protect the species, but he himself is so far removed from baseline humanity that he can't truly understand what it means to be human anymore, if he ever could. He has never experienced the fear of death, never felt truly powerless, never had to accept limitations on what he could achieve. His perspective is so vast, encompassing tens of thousands of years and countless different cultures and contexts, that individual human lives and concerns have become almost invisible to him. This disconnect between the Emperor and the humanity he claims to represent is visible in his actions and decisions throughout his history. He manipulates and discards people with no apparent remorse. He keeps secrets, even from his closest advisors and his own sons. He makes decisions that he knows will result in suffering and death for countless individuals, but which he justifies because they serve his larger vision. He creates tools, whether they be thunder warriors or primarchs or entire planets full of people, and he destroys them just as readily when they no longer serve his purposes. Is this cold pragmatism the result of 40,000 years of isolation, slowly eroding away his humanity? Or was it always part of his nature, us perhaps an inevitable consequence of being created as a collective consciousness of thousands of souls, rather than developing organically as an individual? We can't know for certain, but what we can say is that by the time the Emperor emerged to lead the unification wars, he had already become something that was human in origin, but no longer truly human in nature. The Emperor's current state on the Golden Throne has taken this transformation even further. If there was any remaining humanity in him before his interment, 10,000 years of suffering and endless psychic labor have likely stripped it away. What remains is a will, a purpose, a vast intelligence dedicated to a few specific tasks. Whether that remnant still thinks of itself as the Emperor, whether it has any sense of identity beyond its functions, on whether it experiences anything that might be called consciousness in the way we understand the term, are questions that may be unanswerable. But the power remains. Even as a dying husk on a failing throne, the Emperor is still the most formidable psychic force in the material universe. His will still guides the Astronomicon, still holds back the demons pressing against the webway portal, still manifests in the form of visions and guidance to those he deems important to his purposes. Whether we call him a man or a god or something that transcends both categories, he is undeniably the most powerful being that humanity has produced, and possibly the oldest human who will ever exist. The imperial cult and modern era. One of history's greatest ironies is that the Emperor, who spent 40,000 years fighting against superstition and religion, who formulated the imperial truth specifically to deny the existence of gods and to promote atheistic enlightenment, has himself become the central figure of the largest and most fervent religion humanity has ever known. The imperial cult, also called the ecclesiarchy, when referring to its administrative and clerical apparatus, teaches that the Emperor is not just a powerful human, but is in fact a god, the one true deity worthy of worship, the savior and protector of humanity. This transformation didn't happen immediately after the Emperor's interment on the Golden Throne. For the first few centuries after the Horus Heresy, the Imperium continued to nominally follow the imperial truth, each treating the Emperor as an exceptional leader who was being kept alive through technology rather than as a divine being. But as time passed, as the living memory of the Emperor as an active speaking person faded into history and then into legend, something changed in how people understood him. The shift toward deification was gradual, but probably inevitable. Humans have a fundamental need to believe in something greater than themselves, to find meaning and purpose in a universe that often seems arbitrary and cruel. The Emperor's withdrawal had created a spiritual void that the imperial truth, with its cold rationalism and denial of the supernatural, couldn't fill. People wanted to believe that the suffering they endured had meaning, that their sacrifices served a higher purpose, and that someone was watching over them and cared about their fate. The Emperor provided a perfect focus for this religious need. He was demonstrably extraordinary, possessed of powers that seemed miraculous to those who didn't understand the nature of psychic ability. He had founded the Imperium and led humanity to its greatest heights. He sacrificed himself to save humanity from Horus's betrayal. He continues to protect them even in his dying state, maintaining the Astronomicon that allows the Imperium to function. To people desperate for hope and meaning, the step from acknowledging these facts to worshipping him as a god was small and natural. The development of the imperial cult was also encouraged by certain factions within the Imperium, who saw the political advantages of having a unified religion. A population united in faith is easier to control than one divided by competing beliefs. People who believe they're serving a divine purpose are willing to endure hardships and make sacrifices that those motivated purely by secular concerns might resist. The early administrators of the post-heresy Imperium recognized this, and even if they didn't actively promote the emperor's deification, they didn't discourage it either. By the early millennia of the current age, the imperial cult had become the dominant religion across the Imperium, with the ecclesiarchy wielding enormous political and social power. It teaches that the emperor is the one true God, that he watches over every human soul, that he cares personally about each individual's fate. It promotes the idea that suffering in service to the emperor is noble, that dying for the Imperium guarantees a place at the emperor's side in some vague afterlife. It encourages absolute obedience to authority, framing resistance or questioning as heresy punishable by death. The teachings of the imperial cult vary somewhat from world to world, as local traditions and customs have been incorporated into the broader framework of emperor worship. But certain core beliefs are universal. The emperor is divine and all-knowing. Service to the Imperium is service to the emperor. Heretics, mutants, and aliens are to be feared and destroyed. Faith in the emperor provides protection against the forces of chaos. The emperor will eventually rise again to lead humanity to ultimate victory over its enemies. The irony of this is almost painful in its completeness. The emperor, who believed that religious faith fed the power of the chaos gods and needed to be eliminated, has become the object of faith for trillions upon trillions of humans. Every prayer offered to him, every shrine built in his name, every act of martyrdom performed in his honor potentially feeds psychic energy into the warp. Some theorists have speculated that the emperor is actually becoming a god in the warp, that the accumulated faith of humanity is transforming him into something akin to the chaos gods, but aligned with order rather than chaos. There's some evidence to support this theory. The manifestation of living saints, humans imbued with miraculous powers who perform impossible feats in the emperor's name, suggests that something in the warp is responding to prayers and faith directed toward the emperor. The fact that symbols of the emperor, particularly the Aquila, seem to have protective properties against demons and chaos corruption implies that his presence in the warp has real power, not just symbolic meaning. If this is true, if the emperor is becoming or has become a warp entity sustained by faith, then the imperial truth has been completely inverted, its own principles used to create exactly what it was designed to prevent. The emperor himself, assuming he's aware enough to have opinions about such things, likely views this development with horror. He fought for 40,000 years to prevent humanity from becoming dependent on gods and superstition, and now he has been made into the very thing he sought to destroy. But what can he do? He cannot speak, cannot issue commands, as cannot clarify his teachings or correct the misunderstandings that have accumulated over 10 millennia. He is trapped on the golden throne, able only to maintain his functions and hope that somehow, despite everything, his vision for humanity might still come to pass. The return of Robert Guilliman in the early 42nd millennium brought a direct confrontation between the reality of the emperor and the mythology that has built up around him. Guilliman, who knew his father as an active, speaking being, who remembers the imperial truth and what the emperor actually believed, finds himself leading an Imperium that has become the antithesis of everything his father claimed to stand for. The Imperium is not guided by reason, but by faith. It is not enlightened but deeply superstitious. It is not progressive but stagnant, in holding on to traditions and rituals whose original purposes have been forgotten. Guilliman's meeting with the Emperor confirmed what he had feared. Whatever his father has become over 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, it is not the being who created him and his brothers. The Emperor treated Guilliman with cold indifference, seeing him not as a son, but as a resource to be deployed. There was no recognition of their relationship, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices Guilliman had made or the loyalty he had maintained. Just orders, assignments, the cold calculation of a strategic mind that had long since lost any capacity for warmth or sentiment. This has placed Guilliman in an impossible position. He leads an Imperium that worships his father as a god, but he knows the truth, and that the Emperor rejected divinity and would hate what has been done in his name. He wants to reform the Imperium, to bring it closer to the vision his father originally had, but doing so would require challenging the very faith that holds the Imperium together. He has the authority of a returned Primarch and the blessing of the Emperor himself. But how can he use that authority to dismantle a system that, however flawed and corrupt, is the only thing preventing the Imperium from collapsing entirely? The modern Imperium is a civilization in slow decay, holding on to power and territory through sheer momentum and the inability of its enemies to unite against it. The technology that once seemed limitless is failing, with knowledge of how to repair or replace complex systems lost over the centuries. The Space Marine chapters, those proud inheritors of the Emperor's legacy, are shadows of their great crusade ancestors, following rituals they don't understand and fighting wars that serve no larger purpose. The common citizens of the Imperium live lives of grinding poverty and suffering, told that their misery serves the Emperor's purpose, while seeing no benefit from their sacrifices. And at the center of it all sits the Emperor, dying slowly on his golden throne, the oldest human in existence who has become the youngest god. He has endured for 40,000 years and more, has seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, has guided humanity through its darkest hours and its brightest moments. Now he exists in a state that is neither life nor death, unable to lead, but unable to rest, maintaining through sheer force of will the functions that keep the Imperium functioning while everything he built crumbles around him. Recent developments suggest that the situation may be changing, though whether for better or worse remains to be seen. The Great Rift, a massive warp storm that has split the galaxy in half, has paradoxically strengthened the Emperor's presence in the warp. Reports of miracles and divine intervention have increased, with entire fleets being guided safely through the warp by visions of the Emperor, with dying warriors being revived by what can only be described as divine grace, with living saints manifesting in numbers not seen since the age of apostasy. At the same time, the Golden Throne continues to fail, its ancient systems breaking down in ways that even the most skilled tech priests cannot repair. Or Guilliman and Archmagos Call have reportedly found a partial solution, something that might allow the throne to continue functioning for a few more centuries, but it's a temporary fix at best. The Emperor's eventual death seems inevitable unless some miraculous solution can be found, and when that death comes, it may herald the end of the Imperium as we know it, or it might herald something else entirely. If the Emperor has truly been transforming into a warp entity powered by faith, then his physical death might not mean the end, but rather a new beginning. He might be reborn as a true god, able to act in the warp to protect humanity from chaos, in ways he couldn't while bound to the Golden Throne. Or he might simply cease to exist, his perpetual nature finally exhausted after 10,000 years of unimaginable strain, leaving humanity to fend for themselves in a galaxy that has never been more dangerous. The oldest human's legacy. When we try to evaluate the Emperor's legacy, to determine whether his 40,000-year existence has been a blessing or a curse for humanity, we're confronted with a question so complex that it might not have a definitive answer. The Emperor has shaped human history in ways that are difficult to overstate. He has saved humanity from threats that would have destroyed the species. He has guided us through dark times and helped create moments of transcendent achievement. He has also caused suffering on a scale that is almost incomprehensible, made decisions that resulted in the deaths of billions, and created a civilization that grinds countless lives to dust in service of his vision. The Imperium that exists in the 41st millennium is a direct result of the Emperor's actions and plans. It is a totalitarian nightmare, a theocratic dystopia where individual human lives matter only insofar as they serve the needs of the state and the Emperor. The average citizen of the Imperium lives in abject poverty, working in factories or fields under conditions that would horrify anyone from earlier, more enlightened ages. They are taught that their suffering serves a higher purpose, that the Emperor values their sacrifices, that obedience and faith are the only virtues that matter. This is not what the Emperor intended to create. His vision was of an enlightened humanity, free from superstition and fear, united under rational governance, was progressing toward a future where they would become a psychic species capable of navigating the warp safely. What he got instead was a caricature of that vision, a civilization that has retained the forms of his Imperium while abandoning every principle it was supposed to embody. The Imperium is not enlightened, but dogmatic, not rational, but superstitious, not progressive, but aggressively regressive. How did this happen? How did the oldest and arguably wisest human in existence fail so completely to achieve what he set out to accomplish? The answers are complex and involve both external factors beyond his control and internal flaws in his approach. Externally, the Chaos Gods intervened at every crucial juncture to thwart his plans. They scattered his primarchs when they were infants, preventing them from being raised according to the Emperor's design. They corrupted Horus and half the legions, turning his own sons against him and forcing him into a civil war that destroyed much of what he had built. They remain a constant threat in the warp, feeding on human emotion and desire in ways that make the Emperor's plan of elevating humanity into a psychic species incredibly dangerous. But the external threats, as serious as they are, don't fully explain the Emperor's failure. The internal flaws in his approach were equally significant. His inability to understand or address the emotional needs of his primarchs created the conditions that allowed chaos to corrupt them. His secrecy about the Webway project and other plans meant that when those plans fell apart, and his sons and followers didn't understand what they were supposed to be working toward, his willingness to use and discard people, from the Thunder Warriors to entire planetary populations, created resentment and fear among those who might otherwise have been his most loyal supporters. Most fundamentally, the Emperor's greatest flaw was his certainty in his own vision. He believed he knew what was best for humanity, and he pursued that vision with absolute conviction, unable or unwilling to consider that he might be wrong, that his methods might be counterproductive, that the very act of imposing his will on humanity might undermine the freedom and enlightenment he claimed to want for them. This paternalistic certainty, this belief that he alone could guide humanity to salvation, was perhaps inevitable for a being of his power and experience, but it was also fatal to his goals. Consider what the Emperor achieved versus what he cost. He unified terror, ending millennia of brutal warfare, but he did so through equally brutal conquest, using enhanced warriors that he later betrayed and slaughtered. He launched the Great Crusade, bringing thousands of worlds into a unified human empire, but he did so through military force, destroying countless civilizations and xeno-species, imposing a single vision of what humanity should be on worlds that had developed their own cultures and identities. He created the Primarchs and Space Marines, superhuman warriors who could protect humanity from the countless threats it faced. But in doing so, he set the stage for the Horus Heresy, the worst civil war in human history, Well, one that killed untold billions and crippled the Imperium for 10,000 years. Perhaps most damningly, the Emperor's insistence on the imperial truth, his forceful suppression of religion and faith, created exactly the conditions that would lead to the Imperium becoming the theocratic nightmare it is today. By denying people the spiritual comfort they needed, by insisting that there were no gods even as he himself demonstrated powers that seemed divine, he created a hunger for faith that would eventually manifest in his own worship. The imperial cult exists in part because the emperor so adamantly denied that it should or could exist. And yet, for all of this, for all the failures and the costs and the terrible consequences of his decisions, it's hard to argue that humanity would be better off if the emperor had never existed. Yes, without him, Terra might never have been unified. The Imperium might never have been created. Humanity might have remained scattered across isolated worlds, vulnerable to Xenos predation and chaos corruption, unable to defend themselves against the countless threats that emerged during the Age of Strife. The species might have gone extinct, wiped out by orcs or Dark Eldar, or any of a dozen other threats. The Emperor's existence as the oldest human, his 40,000 years of preparation and planning, his vast accumulation of knowledge and power, all of this was necessary for humanity to survive the transition from the Age of Strife to the modern era. Without him, without his guidance and protection, however flawed, humanity would almost certainly have been destroyed. That doesn't excuse his mistakes or justify his methods, but it does complicate any simple judgment about whether his net impact has been positive or negative. The legacy of the Emperor is ultimately a legacy of survival purchased at an enormous cost. Humanity endures into the 41st millennium because the Emperor fought for its survival. But the quality of that survival, the nature of the civilization he created, leaves much to be desired. The question that faces characters like Guilliman, who must operate within the system the Emperor built while knowing its flaws, is whether it's possible to reform that system without causing it to collapse entirely. Some argue that the Imperium, for all its brutality and oppression, is necessary, were that humanity faces such overwhelming threats that anything less than total dedication to military might and absolute obedience to central authority would result in the species' extinction. That the Emperor understood this and created the Imperium deliberately to be harsh and unyielding, because that's what survival requires in a galaxy as hostile as the one humanity inhabits. Others contend that the Imperium's very brutality makes humanity weaker, that by crushing individual initiative and creativity, by maintaining a rigid hierarchy that stifles innovation, by promoting fear and superstition rather than the enlightenment the Emperor originally envisioned, the Imperium has made itself brittle and vulnerable. That humanity could be stronger, more adaptable, better able to meet the challenges it faces if it didn't spend so much effort maintaining an oppressive system that serves primarily to perpetuate itself. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. The Imperium is both necessary and harmful, both humanity's salvation and its prison. And at the center of this paradox sits the Emperor, the oldest human who tried to save his species and succeeded, but at a cost that grows heavier with each passing century. His legacy is not one of simple triumph or clear-cut failure, but rather a complex mixture of achievement and tragedy, of hopes realized and dreams corrupted, of a vision that partially succeeded while failing in its most important aspects. And so we return to the question we started with. What does it mean to be the oldest human in existence for the Emperor? And it meant having the knowledge and power to guide humanity through its darkest hours. It meant understanding threats that others couldn't perceive and working across timescales that made individual human lives seem like fleeting moments. But it also meant losing touch with what it means to be human, becoming so distant from the species he claimed to protect that he could no longer understand the very beings he was fighting for. The Emperor's age, his 40,000 years of existence, is both his greatest strength and his most terrible weakness. It gives him perspective and capability that no one else can match. but it also isolates him, makes him unable to connect with baseline humans in any meaningful way, turns him into something that is perhaps more alien than the Xenos he fought against. His legacy is the legacy of an immortal trying to guide mortals, of a being who has transcended humanity, trying to preserve it, of a god who insists he is not a god, while his followers worship him as one. Conclusion: the eternal vigil. The story of the Emperor is, at its heart, a tragedy of cosmic proportions. A being created to save humanity from the dangers of the warp, who lived for 40,000 years accumulating the knowledge and power necessary to achieve that goal, who came closer than anyone else ever has to actually succeeding, only to have his plans destroyed by the very forces he was fighting against and the limitations of his own nature. Now he sits on the golden throne, dying by inches, maintaining through sheer force of will the functions that keep the Imperium functioning, while everything he built crumbles around him. Yet for 10,000 years he has endured. Every single day of those 10 millennia, he has focused his vast mind on the tasks that only he can perform. Maintaining the Astronomicon, that psychic lighthouse that guides humanity's ships through the warp. Holding back the demonic tide, pressing against the broken webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace. Possibly, if the accounts of visions and miracles are to be believed, providing guidance and protection to those he deems important to humanity's survival. All of this while his body slowly decays, sustained by technology nobody fully understands, and the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily. The cost of this vigil cannot be measured in any meaningful way. The psychers who die every day to sustain him, 365 million over the course of 10,000 years. The trillions of humans who have lived and died in the grinding nightmare of the Imperium he created. The sons he loved, if he was ever capable of love, now either dead or corrupted or scattered across a galaxy he can no longer directly influence. The vision he held for humanity's future, the dream of an enlightened species free from superstition and fear, twisted into a theocratic dystopia that worships him as the god he insisted he was not. And yet, he endures. Whatever the Emperor has become over these long millennia, whatever remains of the being who once walked among humanity as a guide and protector, it still possesses that fundamental quality that has defined him since his birth 40,000 years ago: the will to continue. Not because he enjoys his existence, not because he finds meaning or satisfaction in what he does, but because stopping would mean the end of everything he has fought for. Because without his presence on the golden throne, the Imperium would fall, and with it would go humanity's last, best hope for survival. Is this determination admirable or tragic? Is the Emperor a hero making the ultimate sacrifice for his species, or a stubborn fool clinging to a failed vision long past the point where he should have let go? Perhaps he is both. Perhaps the truth is more complex than simple categories can capture. He is a being who tried to save humanity and succeeded, but at a cost that makes the victory seem hollow. He is the oldest human who ever lived and who, in living so long, ceased to be human in any meaningful sense. The question of what happens when the Emperor finally dies, when the Golden Throne fails and his 10,000-year vigil ends, haunts the Imperium's nightmares. Will he be reborn, rising again to lead humanity as some prophecies suggest? Will he ascend to true godhood in the warp, becoming the deity his followers already believe him to be? Or will he simply end, his perpetual nature finally exhausted, leaving humanity to face the darkness alone? Whatever the answer, the Emperor's existence has shaped humanity in ways that will endure long after he is gone. The Imperium, for all its flaws, is his creation, built according to principles he established, even if those principles have been corrupted beyond recognition. The Space Marines, those transhuman warriors who defend humanity from countless threats, carry his genetic legacy. The very fact that humanity still exists, still controls vast swathes of the galaxy, still fights against the endless night, is a testament to what he achieved. The Emperor is the oldest human in Warhammer 40,000, and possibly the oldest human who will ever exist. His story encompasses the entire span of human civilization and extends beyond it, reaching back to prehistory and forward to a possible extinction that he has fought for 40 millennia to prevent. He has been humanity's greatest champion and its most terrible burden. He has saved the species countless times and caused suffering on a scale that almost defies imagination. He is everything that humanity might aspire to be, and everything it should fear becoming. As we look toward an uncertain future for the Imperium, as we watch Guilliman struggle to reform a system that may be too broken to save, as we see the Golden Throne fail and wonder what will happen when it can no longer sustain the Emperor's dying form, we are witnessing the final chapters of a story that began before writing was invented. The oldest human's tale is approaching its end, though whether that end brings rebirth or oblivion remains to be seen. But whatever happens, however this story concludes, the Emperor's impact on humanity will endure. He has defined what it means to be human in the grim darkness of the far future, has established the parameters within which humanity must operate if it is to survive. Future generations will live in the shadow of his achievements and his failures, will benefit from the protection he provided, and suffer from the systems he created. He is, for better and worse, the father of the modern Imperium, and his children, and all of humanity, will continue to feel the weight of his choices long after he is gone. The Emperor has sat upon the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, the oldest human maintaining an eternal vigil over the species he claims as his own. How much longer he can endure, nobody knows. But for now, as the Imperium faces threats that would have destroyed it a dozen times over without his protection, he continues. The light of the Astronomicon continues to burn, the seal on the webway continues to hold, and humanity, fractious and violent and endlessly adaptable, continues to survive. That survival is the Emperor's legacy, the one undeniable achievement that transcends all arguments about his methods and his failures. 40,000 years ago, he was born from the collective sacrifice of humanity's first protectors. For 40 millennia, he has endured, watching over the species with a dedication that has cost him everything. And though the end approaches, though the Golden Throne fails, and the enemies gather, and the darkness presses in on all sides, still he maintains his vigil. Still he burns with purpose. Still, the oldest human refuses to die, because dying would mean abandoning the children he has protected for so impossibly long. If you've enjoyed learning about the Emperor of Mankind, the oldest human in Warhammer 40,000, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless other stories to explore in this rich universe, tales of heroes and villains, of sacrifice and betrayal, of hope struggling to survive in the grim darkness of the far future. Join me as we continue to delve into the lore that makes Warhammer 40,000 such a compelling setting, one story at a time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.